While I know this might not be the best time to buy a graphics card, we can still look at the market, look at what prices are, look at if you were to buy at any specific price point, what is the best option in that price point, and what do things just kind of look like overall. Now, let's look at the pricing of the latest model lineups from all the GPU manufacturers. With Nvidia, that's the 50 series coming in with the 5050. It's meant to be a $250 card. They're coming in at mostly $300 and up. The 5060, which is meant to cost $300, is coming in at $350 and up. The 5060 Ti 8GB version is coming in at right around $400 and goes up pretty quickly from there. And the 16GB version is coming in at over $500, and there's very little availability. Now, the 5070 is coming in at $630. It's meant to have a $550 MSRP. The 5070 Ti is meant to have a $750 MSRP, but is currently coming in at about $1,000. And then the 5080, which is meant to have a $1,000 MSRP, is coming in at about $1,300 and goes up very quickly from there. The 5090, which is meant to have a $2,000 MSRP, is well over $3,000, with many models pushing closer to the $4,000 mark. Is AMD doing any better? Well, let's take a look. The 9060 XT is their lowest end current gen card, coming in at $350, but that is only the 8GB version. The 16GB version is coming in at $440 and goes up from there. And I'll just say right here that for people looking for a GPU under $500 and you're buying new, this is probably the one that you'd least regret, given that it does have the 16GB of VRAM and is still coming in almost $100 less than the Nvidia alternative. Now, the 9070 is coming in at $620, and it's meant to be about, I think, man, was this the 500 or the 550 one? Either way, we're way above what its MSRP was, and the 9070 XT was meant to be a $599 MSRP and is currently available a little over $700 and then goes up from there. So what is there to buy? Well, one thing you may have noticed is that there's nothing really under $300. We could check out Intel. They have their Arc B580, which does come in right around $300 right now, but its MSRP is meant to be a lot lower than that. And then they do have the B570, which is coming in at around $250. There's some availability at that price point. All my pricing I'm talking about is in the United States here. Honestly, none of the under $300 options look particularly good, so I would recommend, if you're looking for something in that price point, that you check out the used market, and I highly recommend checking out Jawa.gg, and a huge thank you to Jawa for sponsoring this part of today's video. One thing I'll mention is that the RTX 3060 is a 12GB card. Do check it's a 12GB model like this one. It is, and you can get them at right around $200, and they have 12GB of VRAM. They support the latest DLSS upscaling, not frame gen, but the upscaling, which is the actual performance increase. And I test out a 3060 12GB in all of the latest games, and I'm always able to play the game at 1080p, oftentimes at 1440p display using DLSS upscaling, and have a pretty decent experience. So if you're looking for a budget GPU, this is what I'm recommending. Jawa has a lot of other options and other parts as well. I mean, used memory prices have gone up too, but not as much as the new pricing. If you're looking for something more esports focused, you could look at like the 8GB 3060 Ti at like $230. So definitely check this out. They also have full pre-built systems that you can look for performance in specific games at specific resolutions. It can match your theme of your room. You can fund your upgrade by getting an instant offer on your CPU or GPU for maximum convenience to sell directly to Jawa, or you could create your own listing, become a Jawa seller, set your own price for maximum flexibility. There's tons of great user reviews, and I can save you $10 off your first purchase using code OWEN10. Click the sponsored link in the video description and or pinned comment. But if you're looking at the over $300 price point, that's where we're talking about new GPUs. What are we going to look at? So like I said, you pretty much have cards like the B580 from Intel, the RTX 5050 from Nvidia, and AMD, you'd be looking at a $350 part with the 9060 XT, and this is an 8GB part. So the problem with this is that you're, and again, if we're going up to 350, I guess you also have the RTX 5060 to consider at 350. Again, 5060 Ti's are starting to push much closer to the $400 price point. So if you're looking for under $400, I'm gonna be honest, I'm not excited about any of the options available. That being said, if we look at the B580 as like, okay, that's the cheapest option and it gives you 12 gigabytes, and we look at its relative performance to other GPUs that we see in the similar price bracket, I don't think Nvidia is offering an amazing deal. The 5060 is more expensive, but it's also more powerful. Now, it also drops you down to 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Now, AMD's 9060 XT 8 gigabyte version is coming in as the most powerful at GPU at $350 or less. Also, AMD does have the full 16 PCIe lanes as opposed to the 8 on the Nvidia options, which can cause more issues when you only have the 8 lanes if you are spilling over 8 gigabytes of VRAM. But I'm going to be 100% honest, I don't really like any of these options. So my actual recommendation would be to see if you are in the new market, if you can stretch your budget to the 9060 XT 16 gigabyte version. The 16 gigabyte version does cost $440, but here's what it has going for it. It does have good performance at 1440p and 1080p, and if you're especially at 1440p, you could rely on FSR 4 upscaling, which does look good. Older versions of FSR, kind of garbage compared to DLSS. FSR 4, pretty reasonable compared to DLSS. I still prefer DLSS, but there's a point at which you pass good enough upscaling to get a performance increase without a major image quality loss, and it's extremely usable. FSR 4 is in that category. Now, I still vastly prefer NVIDIA's frame generation and, path tracing and all that. But we're talking GPUs that are a little weak for path tracing, and frame generation isn't really raw performance, but it's kind of nice to have. AMD does have frame generation, but the frame pacing is not quite as good. That being said, to get a similar performance level and VRAM capacity from Nvidia, you're spending over $500 with the 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte version. The cheapest model's $515, and they go up very quickly from there. There's not a lot of availability on them. So if you want a GPU that you can hang on to for a while without worrying about compatibility with the VRAM buffer and all the headaches involved, I recommend the 9060 XT 16 gigabyte. I would hold my nose at the $440 price. I don't like it, but in the current market, this is the lowest priced new graphics card that I can recommend without any major hesitation. Basically saying, well, you're going to have to really have VRAM headaches and just it's probably not going to have a lot of longevity, etc. So this is my lowest priced new GPU that I can recommend without hold my nose and recommend it at the price, but I can at least recommend it without a lot of caveats on what you're getting there. Okay, if we step it up in price point, so the next GPU up from the AMD side of things is the 9070 non-XT. That's coming in about $620. And the next one up from Nvidia, which is also in about that same price class, is the RTX 5070, which is coming in at a very similar $630 price point. The 5070 is a 12 gigabyte card. The 9070 is a 16 gigabyte card. Also, in my testing, the 9070 is about 10% faster. Where's my 9070 review here? This one's the 9070 XT. Here's my 9070. Versus 5070, I have the 9070 10% faster on average. So you get more VRAM, you get 10% more raw performance, but if you look at ray tracing performance, they're about tied, but in path tracing performance, the NVIDIA card is further ahead. Also, like I said, NVIDIA's frame generation is a lot better, and their upscaling is a bit better, but can be noticeably so. So in this case, I would say that I don't strongly recommend either of these GPUs one over the other. 12 gigabytes of VRAM is mostly okay in the vast majority of situations at 1080p and 1440p, and you can always tweak the graphics settings minimally to stay within the 12 gigabyte VRAM buffer. So it's nice to have the extra VRAM, but 12 isn't a disaster. AMD has a bit more raw performance and a bit more VRAM. NVIDIA has a better feature set. They cost about the same, and the performance difference isn't mind-blowing at 10%. That being said, if you can bump your budget up a little bit higher, The next GPU up from AMD is the 9070 XT at about $700, a little bit over, $710, $720. Whereas the next one up from Nvidia is the 5070 Ti at $1,000. This is meant to be at the $750 MSRP price point. So this is where I would say I'm going to, how should I put this? The 9070 XT from AMD at $700-ish is the highest end GPU that hasn't gone completely insane from like a price to performance standpoint. So the best GPU at $700 or less is very clearly the 9070 XT. So then the next question kind of has to be, okay, is it worth spending the extra money over the 9070 non-XT? It's about $100 more. Or the 5070. Again, you're spending about $100 more. So how do they stack up? Well, in my launch review of them, I did look at those comparisons as well. And so in my charts, if I look at the 9070 XT versus the 5070, we're seeing about a 20% performance boost for the XT version over the 5070. So if you're thinking about buying the 5070, but you're like, what about AMD's 9070 XT version? It's $100 more. Is it worth it? You're getting about 20% more performance, which I would say is a more noticeable jump than the 10% performance from the non-XT version. And you're getting that 16 gigabytes of VRAM. And you're getting about the same raw performance as a 5070 Ti, which would be $1,000. So I think the XT makes a bit of a case for itself. Now, it's only about 10% faster than the 9070 non-XT, and it has no VRAM advantage there. So that's where it's a little bit of a hard sell, where the 9070 non-XT is $100 less and is within about 10% of the performance. So the 9070 XT, I'm not going to say it's like a just run out and buy it, it makes sense, but I will say it's the highest end GPU that hasn't gone completely insane from a price point perspective. Now, the one thing that none of these GPUs under $700 are great at is path tracing. So that's where I'm going to say, if you want to buy anything more expensive than this, now you're starting to look at the 5070 Ti, which is $1,000, the 5080, which is $1,300 minimum, and honestly, $1,400 is much more common, or the 5090, which is $3,500 to $4,000. Okay, so let's talk about that. Is there any justification for buying anything above the 9070 XT from AMD or the 5070 from Nvidia? And like I said, I think if you want to chase path tracing, that's really the only justification. And whether or not that makes a lot of sense, Now, the 5070 Ti for 1440p path tracing does a much better job than a 9070 XT or a 5070 non-Ti. But it's $1,000. So this is really just like, if you have the extra money, you do get something for it. But it's tough to spend $1,000 on a 5070 Ti and feel good about it. Now, what about the 5070 Ti? If you're thinking about, okay, I could buy the 5070 Ti, would it be worth it to buy the 5080? I've got to say the answer is just no. It's $350 to $400 more. That's a huge price increase. And if you look at my review of the 5070 Ti against the 5080, I have the 5080 averaging 14% faster than the 5070 Ti, and sometimes less. So the 5070 Ti can do just about anything the 5080 can. And so spending that extra $400, I've really got to say, I mean, if you have $400 to just throw at your build and you've maxed out everything else in your build that makes any sort of sense, and you're not going into like debt over it, but you just want to build a powerful PC, yeah, the 5080 is more powerful than the 5070 Ti by about 15%, but it's way more than 15% more price for that, and it doesn't have any more VRAM or any additional features. Now, the 5090 is insanely expensive. It's also significantly more powerful than a 5080 or a 5070 Ti. So there's that. Tech Power Up has the 5090 at a 50% performance improvement, 52% over the 5080. So it is a significant performance jump. You also now double the VRAM to 32 gigabytes. If you want a GPU that's actually good at 4K path tracing, the 5090 is kind of the only one that's actually really good at that. The 5080 and the 5070 Ti, you know, if you're okay with like 40 to 50 FPS at times and then using FrameGen to make up the difference, okay, but I wouldn't say that's like an amazing experience. Whereas the 5090 can actually reach good performance levels prior to using FrameGen to, you know, do your path tracing experiences and all of that. And if you're somebody who has $3,000 or $4,000 to spend on your GPU and it's not like going to put you into major debt or something, it's a thing you could buy. And it does buy you a very powerful GPU. So let's summarize the overall video. If you have like under $400, I honestly do, like regardless of the sponsorship, recommend checking out the used market. And if you're really on a budget, like $200 or so, I recommend 3060 12 gigabyte as a pretty decent choice. You can play all the latest games and you're not gonna have a ton of VRAM related headaches, get the latest DLSS models, etc. If you're buying on the new market and you can spend a little over $400, I think the 9060 XT 16 gigabyte is the GPU I can recommend for 1080p or 1440p mainstream gaming without getting yourself into some kind of longevity headache related to buying an 8 gigabyte GPU in 2026. Once you're past this point, if you're around the $600 mark, to me, it's kind of a toss-up between the 5070 and the 9070. AMD's got more VRAM and 10% more performance. Nvidia has a better feature set. Pick which one you prefer. 12 gigabytes isn't a complete disaster or anything, but will occasionally cause issues. And as time goes on, it could continue to cause more issues. But NVIDIA has shown a better job of honestly long-term feature sets, especially with thoughts towards like next-gen consoles, having more of a focus on ray tracing, path tracing, and neural features. So there's that, but those things all take more VRAM too. So there's that. So should you spend more? Like I said, best GPU under $700 is the 9070 XT. If you have the additional budget, over the the $600 GPUs, I think you do get something more from the money and you can justify the purchase. Past this point, 5070 Ti is like, if you really have $1,000 to spend, you could. It's hard to justify it from a value proposition. And past that, the 5080, hard to justify from a value proposition, but you get a little more performance. And then the 5090, again, hard to justify from a value proposition, but if you want 4K path tracing at high frame rates, this is the GPU that does it. That's the current GPU landscape in April of 2026. I'll continue to keep an eye on this every month or two. And I'm not saying you need to run out and buy something, but if you do want to buy something, those are my recommendations in the current market that we are living in. So barring time traveling back to, this time last year, that's where we're at. I hope all of you enjoyed the video, found it useful and or interesting, and have an excellent day.